And this is letter 17, the Star. Alice?
So wonderful, and I want to. I'm so glad that John is here, Dory is here, and Charlotte is here. So what I wanted to do was, John had a couple of questions. The commentaries and have seemed to have been sort of short shrifted on the Star. So I would like to again open the floor up first before I launch into anything. And I barely finished this reading. I did manage to scorch my way through the end, but got the gist of it. And I know that Charlotte has some very deep insights about this card, this letter. But John, would you like to pose a question we can just sort of start with?
The thing that really got me excited when he was talking about hope, and hope being very much the principle that keeps things going. And that's reminded me of the Kabbalah, because right at the bottom, you start off at Malkuth, the kingdom, which is where the heart awakes. You go into Yesod, which is the foundation, where you stand up before God and perhaps meet your celestial counterpart. And so that's really the beginning, as it were. And then the next one is Hoth, which is glory. It is God's glory, but it is also our glory. We're always putting ourselves down saying, oh, I'm just a small and wormish character. Actually, we are part of God's glory too. That's not the whole of us, and we are not the whole of that, but there is a oneness between the two. And that immediately goes on to Netzach, which is victory. Certainly God's victory, but it is our victory too, because we are all going to be part of God's victory, no matter how much we bugger things up, in the middle. And I thought, this is exactly what the Star was talking about, and the hope. The hope is, we're not in a hopeless position. We are actually in a very special position, and we are going not to a hopeless situation. This is not a wonderful last stand, death and glory boys and all that sort of nonsense. We are actually part of the thing which is going to win in the universe when God is all and all, and love is the dynamic between all things and everywhere. So that is just where I am at the moment in this. I was so excited about this correspondence with the Star and part of the teaching on the Kabbalah.
Charlotte, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, sorry, I better sit forward so you can hear me. Yes, I think hope is for me the key message of the Star as well. So I think it's really good that you started with hope. Hang on, hold on, clip this. Is that a bit better?
Right on the mic. Yeah, that's a little better. I can see your face.
I feel a lot of people now. Yeah, so a few things with the Star. So we have the hope. I think we also have the agent of spiritual growth.
It's really hard to hear you. It's just muffly, like you're speaking in water.
Can you hear this now? Can you hear it now?
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. That's kind of cool with your face just like right there, Actually, we can't see your face. That's fine.
So, the agent of spiritual growth, he talks a lot at the beginning about fire versus water. And here, water is seen as the growth agent. And I think from an occult perspective, we could go a lot more into water and the idea of fiery water. That's perhaps not something he brings out so directly, but he does talk about the interplay of water and fire. But yeah, this is they're all incredibly spiritual arcana, but the number 17, this being the 17th arcanum, is also the number of resurrection. So I think this very much ties in with what you're saying about hope. Of course, this is the ultimate goal here. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Charlotte, you don't have one of those headphones with a microphone attached to them, do you?
No,
Yeah,
no, I don't. I'm sorry.
I want to just tell you, I think technically what's wrong with your mic is that there's a compression setting on it, that it's every time your voice gets dynamic, it just pulls back the volume. There's some sort of compression setting on it that's I haven't heard before, so maybe it can be fixed. I don't know.
Yeah, it's turned up full, so sorry.
It could be that. See, it could be that it's turned up full is the problem, because the condenser mic in it is overloading, and so it's just cutting back. It's like a noise gate, actually. I know a little bit about mics, and it could be that.
Is that better?
Yeah, maybe the volume down would be better.
Yeah, could be.
And I think if we can actually see your face, maybe we can read your lips a little bit too.
Yeah,
That might
yeah.
make it.
Oh dear.
So
Charlotte,
the other thing I was going to say about the hope,
better.
which comes later, is when he's talking about the two streams. So if you think that the angel of the card is holding two jars, a silver and a golden jar, which are both being poured into the water. And he talks about the tragedy, actually, of the human condition and the spiritual path in that. The left-hand path and the right-hand path are both being poured into the same stream. So not only everything that's good and pure and spiritual and alive and hopeful is being poured into the stream, but also everything that's dark and polluted and dangerous, and this is in a way the cross we're having to bear, in that the stream, it's all mingling in one stream. And I think if you especially consider what's happening today with the pollution of the natural world, we've got a direct correspondence, because our actual waters are being polluted as the spiritual waters are. But I think again, there is hope in that it's not all our faults. It's the way it is. You know, before things come to earth, they begin in heaven. So there's also, you know, this malign influence comes to earth as well as the spiritual, and this is what we see in the star. And when we get to later Arcanum in the moon, I think that dark side becomes more apparent. Of course, we then get through that to the sun. So the hope is always, you know, will always triumph in this situation. And I think the star is a really, it's a great, it's a turning point, isn't it, for us in the Arcana. And I think the idea of resurrection is something to hold fast when we go into these final stages of the tarot.
This is interesting because, I feel like after the Tower of Destruction, there's suddenly just a breakthrough. There's an opening up, and suddenly we're allowed to see starlight. We're allowed to see light, but it's starlight, which is dim and far, but it's there. It's very real. And so I think symbolically and then we sort of zoom into the moon and then the sun, which envelops it all. So that's that's wonderful for that big picture. And what you said, I talked with Charlotte the other night, and Charlotte, I don't know if you had a chance to read a little bit more about the composer Peter Warlock.
A little bit. I listened to his music.
He's a perfect example of what you're talking about the left and right hand path and commingling, because he wrote like one of the most beautiful Christmas hymns ever, which is Bethlehem Down. And it is very inspired, beautiful poetry. It's a very, very beautiful song. But Peter Warlock himself turned out to be, he was an upper class British fellow who was a music critic and this and that, but he developed a double personality. And his other personality decided he was just too ordinary in his original name. So he took on the name Peter Warlock, but also dabbled in the occult and got involved with Aleister Crowley. And I read a very strange thing where he talked about how he found realms. He went into the astral realms. He found realms where he was inspired by music that no human could even possibly understand, because it was this very arcane sphere that he went into. So, wow, dangerous waters, dangerous waters. He was in those mixed waters because there was inspiration there, and he was clearly inspired. And there was also muddiness and disarray, and it tore him apart. He ended up committing suicide or being murdered, not sure, but he died at 36. It's very tragically. And he was a very promising young composer in England. This is in the 20s and 30s. He died in 1930.
Isn't it? But this astral agent, it's the agent of magical growth. And it's also very strongly linked to our emotions, the whole of the astral level. I mean, there's a bit of a warning over the astral for people engaged in a Christian practice of the dangers, whereas the left-hand practices actually encourage, it's all about the astral. For the very reason you mentioned there, that you do access these realms, but then there's this price to pay, and it's how do we, maintain the balance there, I think.
Yeah, that was just a sidebar, but I listened to a podcast about Peter Warlock's death, and they quote from Aleister Crowley, where Aleister Crowley says Peter Warlock went into places I wouldn't even go.
Wow.
And so it's like, wow, that was scary to hear, because Crowley was always about do what thou wilt, and was always encouraging people to experiment.
And when you have somebody who has a creative genius, of course, that astral agency is amplified anyway, because they already have this open channel, which is enabling them to produce what they do. In this case, some kind of force linked with the power of music, which I can imagine would be.
And it's very poignant, because somewhere I read that he took his life because he lost his muse. He lost his inspiration, and he was in despair. So wow, I mean, just to think about this, that's a very concrete example of what you're talking about with the left and right hand path waters, the waters of inspiration and the waters of human desires.
And being bereft when the spirit leaves, because that's like almost a daimonic presence, isn't it?
What did you say? Again, the muddiness.
It's like a daimonic presence, D-A-E-M-O-N-I-C, which when the connection is there is like life, and everything. But then I can imagine when it leaves, having really probably sucked you dry, and out comes the composition and the work of great genius, but then what's left inside you?
That's right. So I didn't mean to go into this, but it was an interesting sidebar, because this Peter Warlock just came to my attention. I recommend you go listen to Bethlehem Down. It's extraordinary. If that's the only Peter Warlock composition you listen to, Bethlehem Down, you can find the King's Singers sing it, and Voces 8 and various recordings of it. It's very, very beautiful. I'm obsessed with it. I found this because I'm singing this with a choir for Christmas lessons and carols. And so I was very inspired by that particular piece of music. It really moves me to tears. So there's something about Peter Warlock. There's something about him. It's a very poignant story. Anyway, back to the star. Let me just jump into this. The image of the star card is, starting from the top, there's a constellation of 8 stars. There's one central star surrounded by 7 other stars. They are colored gold and red. Below the stars in the firmament, there's a landscape that has 2 trees or shrubs growing in it. And in the center, writ large and drawn large, is a woman who's kneeling into a stream, and she's holding 2 jugs. And I forget the colors, but one of the jugs of water is gold and the other is silver. I think that gold and silver jugs, and she is pouring the liquids into one common stream below her feet. And she's kneeling, and she fills up the space of the card largely. She's very present in this card. So to move right into what Tomberg says, this card is what he would call the Arcanum of Growth. Therefore, it is also the Arcanum of Hope. I'm just going to give a summation. It's the Arcanum of Hope and of maternal continuity, because there's the mystery of motherhood is explored here. The mystery of the maternal is explored here also. So that's just a quickie thing. We have the contrast between the Arcanum of the Tower of Destruction we just left, which is a construct, and this Arcanum, which invites us to think about growth. So he contrasts a construction of a tower with a tree. The tree grows incrementally, bit by bit, in a steady continuity of sap and cells, which move upward and outward. There's a gradual increase in an upward motion and an increase in volume, as opposed to the tower, which is man-made, which grows in leaps and bounds and is built with bricks and mortar, and it's dry. So we have this contrast of dry construction as opposed to wet, flowing growth. So he talks about the agency of flowing growth. He refers to it as the sap of life. He calls it many things, but he's getting at this astral magical agent, that this flow, this sap of life, is an agent of transformation, and it brings things from the ideal to the real. So it's a sap that moves up and down from the celestial spheres into our sphere, and can be, as through inspiration. But it's a way that we manifest on our plane the agency of the celestial spheres, which would emanate from the stars. So imagination can become reality through this agent of astral magic. But the human being, and I'm just going to jump ahead, the human agency, as was pointed out, the human agency by itself, which can only generate personal magic or personal energetic flow in this direction, using the elements of life forces, is not the same as the divine coming down. As John pointed out in the Kabbalah, there's the point of glory, which seems to be where the universal celestial spheres intermingles with the human incarnation through the blood. And through the blood and the inspiration of the blood creates most amazing things and wonderful things. But there has to be that flow down and up. Whereas
can I just jump in and say something?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
About the Kabbalah? This puts me very much in mind of the middle pillar, the Shem pillar, which John was talking about, because the bottom part of that pillar is the Shin, which is fire, and the fire purifies the pathways and the channels. As it rises upwards towards Tiferet, it then joins with the Mem, which is the water side part, and that's where you get the mingling, because this water, the Mem, represents the divine influx coming down. It then meets with the fire, and which has already purified the channels, and then you get the magical agent, the Shem, the name, the pillar of the name is created. So that just ties in with
the fiery water. Yeah.
Fiery water. Yeah.
So keep the idea of the fiery water in your mind. It's an amazing image.
It's because it just runs through the tarot so much, and if you think about the seal of Solomon, the six-pointed star, that's the symbol of the fiery water, of the masculine and feminine principles, and
yes. The chalice and the blade.
Yeah.
Yes. So this card is all about agency, human agency and divine agency, and how things are enacted, how they come about. So I'm going to jump on. The Hermeticist reasons or postulates that there's a structural agent of growth as a necessary structural exigency in reality. So again, going back to the fire, the Arcana of fire being the tower, that magical agent of fire that can be generated from below. You know, as you point out, from the central pillar, man has access to fire. He can invent fire and work with fire from the very beginnings of Malkuth, from his very foundation. He has access to fire. But the agent of growth is water in this arcana. And also temperance deals with the water moving back and forth, yes, between the two vases. This is very similar. This is also, I'm riffing here, but it relates to me to balance of the second arcana, the idea of the two, the lemniscate, they're all connected this way. And of course, he brings in the Empress also. But the growth, the structural agent of growth is a necessary agency. The angelic inspiration is that flow of the divine waters coming into fire. He quotes Teilhard de Chardin. I mean, he talks about Teilhard de Chardin a lot in this letter. And I'm thinking about what's the famous Teilhard de Chardin quote, which is, when man discovers fire for the second time. That's his analogy for when man comes into glory. At the Omega point, he will have discovered fire for the second time. So there's continuous transformation, and there's creative lightning, and there's the sorcerer with a wand. You know, the sorcerer can send out this creative lightning, but the water and the fire must be working together for evolution and progress. He divides water as being, as he talks about water as being an agent of evolution, progress, education, natural therapy, and living tradition, that this is what water brings. Fire being creationism, out of nothing, ex nihilo, invention, the elements of election, surgery, prosthesis, revolution. These sort of constructions emanate out of fire as an agent. So he goes long and wide into Goethe's Faust, and compares, you know, brings Anaxagoras, who was known for his materialistic views. He connects him with fire as a pre-Socratic philosopher, and then brings up Thales, who was he places squarely on the side of water as a mathematician and an astronomer, one of the 7 sages of Greece. Thales was the founder of natural philosophy, and he developed the scientific method and initiated the first Western Enlightenment. That was my little bit of research into Thales. So in Faust, he pits these two against each other and for contrast. And so Goethe is aligned, according to Tomberg, with all that flows, with the principle of continuity. He also brings up the Leibniz as a philosopher who he feels had the Hermetic principle of continuity. And that he a wonderful phrase that Leibniz threw the bridge of the rainbow of continuity out there. That continuity, that there's a thesis and antithesis, but that there's a rainbow of continuity that moves through these principles, and that ultimately the work of peace is to bring them these antitheses into a unity. And this is something that Charlotte has referred to before, the bringing together of the polarities and the opposites, which is always the Hermetic task. Yes, it's always the Hermetic task to do this. Working with fluidic thought instead of crystallized thought. This is a very important principle in the Hermetic method. Fluidic thought, which is the work of peace. And he goes on to, you know, there's a passage on 467 that I've noted to read. So I will look at that, whatever that was. Yes. It was again the principle of continuity, the water, quote unquote, of Hermeticism, which led Leibniz to the discovery of the basis of differential calculus is simply the application of the principle of continuity. The fluidic mode of thought instead of crystallized thought in the domain of mathematics, infinitesimal calculus comprising differential and integral calculus. The alpha and omega of thought become fluidic in mathematics, is an application of the principle of continuity. It is the fruit of the admission of the agent of growth into the domain of mathematics, where previously the principle of construction reigned alone. So that's that little bit. Then he goes into Shmakov's Sacred Book of Thoth, which Charlotte knows much about this, as a monumental Hermetic work. So Charlotte has been doing monumental work in bringing that to the public awareness, that book. Then he goes on to talk about Henri Bergson, and expands on Henri Bergson's idea of flux, continuity of transition, that change itself is what is real. This very much sounds to me like the Tao. This very much sounds like Taoist philosophy to me. It is change is all is change. That change is the only thing that is actually real. To me, this is so. What Tomberg says is that Bergson is describing this intuition of the experience of the principle of growth. He goes on to, so yeah, again, he brings up fire. There's the divine celestial fire, capital F, fire. There's the electrical fire, small f, which is due to friction, which is what man generates from the level of Malkuth, from the level of the earth. Water, capital W, water is the celestial sap of growth, and water, small w, is the collective unconscious, which engulfs and drowns out and floods individuality. All right, so this is really interesting dynamics here. 17th Arcanum, the woman in the Arcanum, is pouring water from the two vases into the common blended stream. We talked about that. The mud of the serpent of old, and a kind of godly fluid. These are the two quotes that flow in the veins of the human race. Okay, so herein lies the tragedy of the human life and mankind's history and cosmic evolution. So the role of action and will, role of action and will in the present, and the role of hope and understanding for the future. These are elements which are brought together, and this is what creates the human condition. Action and will in the present, which we have the freedom to enact. And then, but what is the role? The role of hope and understanding for the future. So he talks about the major philosophers of these concepts, which is Zarathustra, Buddha, and Manichaeism. The fight against the somnolence of the will. So the somnolence of the will, meaning the will being asleep, the work of awakening this dormant will, the sleeping will, the desire to ignite effort, and the will. This is what the spiritual practices are all about. But when that will is awakened, that's when you have to be careful, because of course there's the dangerous waters of expressing through the personal will, and working personal magic through personal gnosis and magic. That's where trouble can begin. Zarathustra says we're exercising our choice. And in Zarathustra's philosophy, we must say yes to the light and no to the darkness at all times. With Buddha is helps us to he's helping us to awaken the will from the somnolent condition. The somnolent condition for him is the routine of desires, habitual desires, automatism, and to give free rein to the creativity of the spirit. That this is Buddha's contribution. Mani's contribution was as a synthesizer of the teachings of Zarathustra and Buddha within Christianity, and to awaken the goodwill of the whole of mankind to say yes to the eternal spirit and no towards the transitory things of matter. So, and I had a quote on page 471 concerning that. So he talks about the light force here. This is where the light force is connected to the idea of hope. The light force, which emanates from the star, constituted through the marriage of contemplation with activity, and which is the antithesis, of the thesis that there is nothing new under the sun, is hope. It proclaims to the world, what has been is that which prepares what will be. And what has been done is that which prepares what will be done. There is only that which is new under the sun. Each day is a unique event and revelation which will never be repeated. Hope is not something subjective due to an optimistic or sanguine temperament, or to a desire for compensation in the sense of modern Freudian and Adlerian psychology, i.e., it is a light force which radiates objectively and which directs creative evolution towards the world's future. And then I'd like to go on to the next page where he says, in other words, hope is what moves and directs spiritual evolution in the world. Insofar as it moves, it is an objective force. And insofar as it orientates and directs, it is a subjective light. This is why we speak of it as light force. So that's an important principle he lays out there. And because he's laying out the idea of hope. And I think you all get that. I think that was one of the most obvious points of this Arcanum. And of course, as Charlotte points out, hope points directly towards resurrection light. So to move on, we have the constellation of the 8 stars. One central star with 7 surrounding represents the contemplative. There's the contemplative element of the gold star, which is understanding. And then there's the active element in the red star, which is will. And he talks about justice in terms of combining understanding and will. Contemplative justice and active justice must be superimposed upon each other. They must always be married. The nailing of the opposites to one another is what he talks about again here. That transforming the future into promise. And so again, that's the central pillar, right? In the Kabbalah, Malkuth, not Malkuth, but severity and mercy. Again, that balancing of severity and mercy is important. So star car represents hope. And then he goes on to talk about the Arcanum of the mother, that this is the Arcanum of the mother. Mother, Eve, creatrix, and of course, Mary. Mary has got to be mentioned here. He doesn't mention Mary directly here. It's kind of surprising to me, but Mary is definitely pointed out here. I am the Alpha and the Omega from Revelation 21:6. On page 472 in the middle, the quote there is, I am the Alpha and the Omega. This is how the message of the central star of the card of the 17th Arcanum arrow reads, which means to say, I am activity, the effective cause, who set in motion, and I am contemplation, the final cause, who draws towards himself all that which is in movement. I am primordial action, and I am eternal waiting for all to arrive where I am. That's a very beautiful, wonderful quote. So hope is the fruit of the marriage of opposites. We work towards a realization of this unity of opposites, which is, again, what we've talked about many times here. it's accomplished, it's the endeavor to see together. So the endeavor to see together involves a certain way of seeing. Seeing the essence of biological growth, the agent of growth, and the spiritual and the element of spiritual growth, seeing them with one eye together, which is why he talks a lot about Teilhard de Chardin, the idea of spiritual evolution, working with biological evolution hand in hand and reaching this omega point. From Genesis, again, he quotes, where God separates the intuition about water. This is very interesting about the intuition about the essence of water. He quotes from Genesis 1:7, the second day, where God separated the waters, which were under the firmament, from the waters which were above the firmament. So we have this agent of water, which is the divine fluid sap, which rains down and brings growth. It's hope. It's the agent of growth in spiritual evolution. There's a transformability of things in conformity to their prototypes. So we've often talked in Thomas about the alignment of our prototype with our divine image, our icon, the idea of lining those up, the conformity to our divine prototype. That is the work of transformation. That is the work of the alchemical process of turning base metal into gold. So we have the consciousness above, which is those stars. And then we have the consciousness below, which is those waters. And they are one stream. They are all inclusive of the waters of both divine inspiration and the muddy serpent. Okay, it's a mixed bag. In between, we have woman. Woman is the agent which brings in this unity between the divine realm of the waters above and the waters below. So the amniotic sac, the fluid for which brings forth life from the amniotic sac, which is the sea. So we have that symbology. And there's a wonderful quote about motherhood there. Every mother knows. Where was that? Every mother knows, insofar as she is a mother, that underlying the flow of generations, there is at work the primordial magical impulse of the effective cause, the alpha of the world. And that the final cause, the omega of the world, will not fail to direct it and draw it towards itself. In other words, each mother professes, by the very fact that she is a mother, the divine origin of the world and the divine aim of the world. So that's the essence of hope right there. And so I, of course, see the mystery of the mother as depicted through the Christmas mystery. There's a mystery of the mother, mystery of the father. So we have the mystery of the mother, which is the pangs of childbirth, the biological and spiritual evolution, which must move forward through continuity, through tradition, through the bloodlines. Okay, we've seen this theme before. Then there's the mystery of the Father, which is the salvation through the Son. And when we combine these, we come, to me, to the Christmas mystery of the birth through Mary, of the salvation through the Son, through the human vessel. And so that's my insight here. I very much feel that that's what this is. When we have archetypal stories like the story of Christmas, what is that resonates in us? It's a mystery. It's such an amazing mystery. And every single year, when I contemplate this in Advent, I come to new understandings. The mission of Hermeticism, he goes on to say, is to bring a synthesis of evolution and salvation, to bring forth through the two truths of science and religion, which together bear the message of hope. So the synthesis of evolution and salvation, which is why, of course, he's using Teilhard de Chardin extensively here, But I wanted to quote here from 474, the synthesis. Where was that? Okay, yeah, henceforth, everyone can contemplate the serpent of evolution. This is an amazing sentence, so you may have to hear this twice. Henceforth, everyone can contemplate the serpent of evolution crucified on the cross of divine providence, and the Son of God crucified on the cross of evolution of the serpent, and from thence draw hope for life and death. Here, evolution and salvation, the two truths of science and religion, are no longer contradictory. They bear together the message of hope. So there's that resurrection. That was just startling to me, the idea of contemplating the serpent of evolution crucified on the cross of divine providence, which of course is the serpent of Moses, isn't it? Serpent on the cross of Moses is a foreshadowing of that, is it not? So there's resonances through the Bible about this image, and then the cross of divine providence, and then the Son of Man crucified on the cross of evolution of the serpent. God descending to man and being crucified on the cross of evolution of the serpent, and from thence we draw hope for life and death. That's just stunning. So worth contemplating that little piece right there. So according to Tomberg, the world then becomes a great alchemical laboratory of modern transformism. And so then he ties it all together with ora et labora, ora being the vertical axis, grace, and then labora being, here's the cross, endeavor, effort, labora. Okay, and so he combines the modern laboratory with the mystical oratory, and they must be linked. The Augustinian vision of the terrestrial city and the city of God, which is achieved through the cross. So then he discusses poetry as a crucial means of harnessing the elan of the imagination, and it's crucial to Hermetic expression. And he gives the examples of the Bible and the Zohar, and the poetry of St. John of the Cross, Teilhard de Chardin, and the emerald tablets of Thoth, and also the major arcana of the Tarot. All of these are vehicles of poetry. And then he says a very interesting thing about poetry. Now, poetry is not simply a question of taste, but rather one of fertility or sterility of the spirit. Excuse me. Without a poetic vein, there can be no access to the life of the Hermetic tradition. So let us therefore love poetry and respect the poets, for it is not dukes, margraves, and counts who constitute the true nobility of mankind, but rather the poets. One is noble in the sense of the nobility of the heart, insofar as one is a poet at heart. And since every human soul is in principle a priest, a nobleman, and a worker at one and the same time, let us not smother the nobility within us by an overestimation of practical aims or by a preoccupation with our salvation. But on the contrary, let us ennoble our work and our religion by bringing in the breath of poetic inspiration. Isn't that wonderful?
The troubadours.
The troubadours.
Yeah, the ground cycle. I think he's going into something really deep there, isn't it? Maybe even his own past life and the mysteries of past before.
Wonderful resonances there, and you can explore that endlessly. It's interesting because I was first introduced to the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson through his prose, and he's a wonderful transcendental philosopher, American transcendental philosopher. And then I tried to read his poetry, and frankly, Emerson's poetry is a little flat-footed. It's a little bit stiff and awkward. But when he tried to write poetry, it was awkward, but his prose is poetry. Emerson's prose is where his poetry is. So I think it's where he was less self-conscious and he was able to let the poetic spirit flow. But the moment he tried to be a poet, it was like, maybe not, Emerson, maybe not, Ralph, maybe move on, go back to the prose, stick with the prose. But yes, but that's very important to understand. The last bit here, he goes on into the incarnation of the necessity of being incarnated, the blood. Does anybody know, have anybody seen Mozart in the Jungle? It's a TV series, a wonderful TV series. And it's a Mexican, he's a Mexican conductor of the New York, of a New York orchestra, New York City orchestra. And he's always talking about playing music with the blood, the blood. That's that passion, that energy. It has to come through the blood. And he's talking about that poetic agency right there. That's what he's talking about, that fire in the blood, which is the blood is itself a fluid, is it not? And it can be fired up by fire. He talks about magical formula here, mantrams, where he discusses like the Psalms of David as being sacred mantrams, that they are extremely powerful magical formulae. And they have significance in the three worlds. So he says mantrams, formulae of magical significance in the three worlds are born from the marriage of warmth and light, from earthly blood, the bearer of continuity, and from celestial blood, the bearer of hope. So there's a long section on the agency of magical formulae here, born from blood and light. Beautiful. He contrasts arbitrary personal magic with sacred magic. So personal will fortified by evil electrical forces in the serpent. And that represents the closed circle of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, is this closed circuit of personal will flexed through personal agency of magical formulae. It's always going to be a closed circle. He includes science in this, modern science. He throws that into this closed prison system, okay? Versus sacred magic, the agent of growth, which is heaven on earth, Jerusalem at the head, and is reality. And this is removed from human arbitrariness as it's an agency, and only God and his servants can summon miracles. Okay, so while magical phenomena can happen with the sorcerer, it's always limited to magical sorcery, but miracles are the descent of hope into the human realm, where miracles happen. And so miracles, which are of course acts of magic also, but sacred magic is quite different than this closed circle. So he talks about the spiral as being representing the open agency of being open to the heavens, being open to the agency of celestial magic, sacred magic, which comes into our realm through manifested in miracles. And this is where he says, Christ says, I am the door. He quotes from John. I am the door. There is an exit from every closed circle, from all captivity of the spirit. And he quotes Christ again, says, if anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The green fields of Jerusalem. So he explicates the spiral of the history of man as all being in preparation for the coming of Christ. So he goes into the 14 generations. There's 3 circles or steps. It gets very complicated here. I recommend that you go, when you have some time this next month, go and read the end bit here, which is very easy to say, okay, I've had enough. But as the spiral as the Arcanum of Growth is where it starts on page 483. You can start there. And it goes on. I have no time to explain, but page 484 is a very dense summation of what he's talking about here in terms of the 3 levels. And he starts with the patriarchs, goes through David, works through the 14 generations from David to Christ. He also links this with the 3 steps of spirituality symbolized by gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I don't have time to go through this now. You may go through this at your leisure. And what a beautiful time to do it is at Advent, to read about the gold, frankincense, and myrrh and the symbolism there. He, in fact, goes on to talk about John the Baptist. John the Baptist represents purity of heart. He represents one of the final steps in the purification process of salvation in developing the pure heart who can recognize the Christ. Okay. He then goes on to talk about the call to the present day Hermeticist on the last page. We were talking about this, and I'm going to jump to it so we can. There's wonderful stuff intervening here. It's very beautiful, but very dense. So I recommend that you don't give short shrift to the end of the star. There's so much there because he's tying this all together with the Hermetic tradition and the Hermetic continuity of tradition. And he, at the very end, talks about the call to Hermeticists now. And I'll read this to close. The Emerald Table is a concise summary of what the ancient world had to say on the subject of the agent of growth and evolution. The major arcana of the tarot are a summary developed into a school or practical system of spiritual exercises of what the medieval world had to say on the subject of this agent as the fruit of its meditation on the Emerald Table and of its own efforts and spiritual experiences. In our time, therefore, it is a matter of the task of effecting the 3rd step of the evolutionary spiral of the Hermetic tradition, the 3rd Renaissance on the subject of the Emerald Table. Our time makes appeal to the collective endeavor of Hermeticists of today to make a 3rd summary, which will be for our time what the tarot was for the Middle Ages and what the Emerald Table was for antiquity. Thus, just as the Emerald Table saved the essence of ancient wisdom, and just as the tarot saved the essence of medieval wisdom across the deluges which occurred in the time that separates us from them, may the essence of modern wisdom be saved in a spiritual Noah's Ark from the deluge which is going to come, and may it thereby be transmitted to the future, just as the essence of ancient wisdom and that of the medieval wisdom has been transmitted to us by means of the Emerald Table and the major arcana of the tarot. The tradition of Hermeticism blossomed in the past and must live in the future. This is why a new modern summary is required, which will be as viable as the Emerald Table and as the major arcana of the tarot. So there's a stamp of Tomberg's stamp of hope upon the path of the Hermeticist. And boy, what an imprimatur that is. It leaves much to be contemplated. So thank you, I'm done with that.
That was wonderful. It was just so good to hear that I've not read that letter properly for a long time, but it was just, yeah, it is hope, isn't it? There's so much in there. I mean, there's so many things in the background, and then it just comes up into this amazing synthesis in that letter. Even the thoughts about the mother, we know how close he was to his own mother who was killed, and I can just imagine him thinking of her as he was.
Say that again, Charlotte. I couldn't hear what you said. The thoughts about
his mother.
Oh, yeah, move closer. His mother.
His mother, because she was killed, and he must have been thinking. I mean, in some ways it's a tribute. I don't feel the sadness in the letter, just a lot of hope, like you say. It comes from having come from the tower and the devil, past the halfway point of the tower, and we then just get this wonderful shaft of light from the star. And I think we should take it as a shaft of light. And there's so much there, the Kabbalistic influences that John was talking about. It's just a wonderful, wonderful letter. And then he goes back again to the Tetragrammaton. Like you're saying, it goes even deeper. And I agree with you that last section is really there's a lot of deep contemplation. I'm going to read it all again myself, especially that last part.
He does not mention the Kabbalah in that series.
It's
That's
implied,
interesting to
isn't
me.
it? It's just more implied, and then he gets to the tetragrammaton. So
It's more, it's implied.
Yeah.
He brings up the tetragrammaton in the Star, by the way. He does talk about the Yod He Vav He. And so I skipped over that, but that's in there too. This is a very, very rich letter, of course. And
it's a bit more in the Tarot Minors. I don't know if you'll be able to hear me, but just thinking about the Mem and the Shin. What he says about Mem, which is the water, is just confirms everything he said. It's as a spiritual influence that comes from on high and creates the disciple. If he, by previous conscious effort, prepared his internal content to receive this superior influence, that would be the fire purifying. It is the spiritual strength that acting from outside through the Akasha can transmute the human being ready for this transmutation. And then he talks about the Aleph and the Shin as well. The Aleph, by the way, being the uppermost part of the tree, so Shin, and the Aleph is between Tiferet, going through Dar to Keter at the top. So they talk about Tatwaz in this as well. It goes very convincing because you touched on that as well, not with the Taoism at least.
talks about the what? Again, I couldn't hear that.
Sorry, the Tatwaz. That's another the minors.
Oh yes, yes, there you go. And that is that book a breakdown of the minor arcana?
That's the minors. And the one I was reading from was the Eight of Coins, which corresponds to the Star.
Oh my gosh. The Eight of, okay, yes, great.
Because 17, 1 plus 7 is the 8.
Is 8.
It also corresponds to the 8th Arcanum and the 17. So there's a link between the two.
And 8 is the number of Christ.
Yeah.
888 is the number of Christ.
1 plus 7. Yeah.
So this is 1 plus 7, resurrection. So
yeah.
There's all of this, there's all of this symbology in all these different directions. There's numerology and there's gematria. It goes so deep. And I know this can be overwhelming, but if you just play with it lightly, again, effortless effort, try to keep the Hermetic principle of just play with it. And eventually it starts to sink in. I think you would agree, John. John seems to have gained a lot of depth of understanding about the Sephiroth and the Tree of Life. It seems to me you've gotten a lot of, you've made a lot of headway with the Kabbalah, John. Are you muted? You are muted.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted now.
There you go.
I don't think there's any great depth of wisdom or study in this. I think it is when you find that they insinuate themselves into your spirituality and your prayer life. Because you start off reading the Kabbalah or whatever, and you just think, what on earth is this about? And then certain patterns come and get you excited, like I was at the beginning of this session. But I mean, gracious me, the gaps are far greater than the continuity in my understanding of the Kabbalah and everything else. But it does, even when I don't understand Tomberg, I am aware that there is a current behind it, which actually is beginning to open things up. And so I think this is the sort of thing you can go back to and should go back to all the time.
It is the spiraling action.
The spiral, yes.
It is the spiral. This is my second time through the meditations. And oh boy, I get to go back and read passages where I didn't make any notes or any underlining. And I know that those were passages where I was just kind of like probably spacing out. It is not easy to go at the first go. It's not easy at all. And neither is, you can't, you simply must absorb this and digest it as you must with understanding any of these systems like the Sephiroth. You know, this is not something you just, like you said, it's not intellectual. It's not brainstem material. It's whole spirit, body, soul, mind together. And when Charlotte is talking about the purification of the fire, which comes through the channels, and the channels have to be purified. In yoga, this is known as the nadis. These channels, they physically actually open through fiery purification practices. And in yoga, it's done through, what we call hot yoga. You know, hot yoga is, maybe people today use it to get yoga butt, to get like a nice body, but it's an entry point into this purification of Raja Yoga, which is a fiery, hot process of burning the impurities and allowing divine fire to come in to your system. Your system cannot endure divine fire unless it's been purified. And this can be done through effort to a degree. But I also think, Tomberg would warn that you also need grace. There has to be effort, there has to be labora, but there must also be grace. It cannot be done solely by human effort, because that takes you through that takes you only into the electrical field.
Yeah,
it will not. And so trying to awaken the Kundalini energy yourself and burst through all those chakras, to try to do that without the purification practices of a spiritual practice, you're going to get into trouble, and you will be stopped. You will be halted by the Tower of Destruction, because you'll just destroy your own nervous system, just to be blunt about it. Anyway, sorry, Charlotte, what were we saying?
I was just going to say that the middle pillar corresponds to the Sushumna. Is that how you pronounce it? Because you have is it Nadia Pingala?
We're having a hard time hearing you. So hard. The Sushumna. Yes. Interestingly, in the Sushumna, there's Ida and Pingala. Now, Ida and Pingala are the two serpents that the caduceus that wind around the Sushumna. Okay, this is a little esoteric, but one is silver and one is gold. Ida, Pingala. One is silver and one is gold. Same with those fiery waters. So this is, I'm just got that intuition just now. That's great. They are across all the traditions. You can find these symbols. And the Sushumna is the central shaft. Yes, it would be the central pillar. And all the chakras are on, those major chakras are on the Sushumna. And if you try to bring up Ida and Pingala too quickly, and they hit these centers, you hit these centers with too much fiery effort, you can go mad. It will actually burn you out. It will burn you. You will actually burn. And when that happens, you can go mad. And this is the danger of sorcery also.
And it also happens from above, because there's a shattering of the vessels that occurs in Gabura. So there's a danger from below, but when it comes from above, I suppose it's part of the process that we have our own controlled will acting. I totally agree with you. It can just completely kill you, as we probably saw with Warlock, Mr. Warlock.
With Mr. Warlock. And also with yogis, there are many yogis who gained these supernatural powers. They're called siddhis. They're supernatural powers. And it went to their head and they became, sexual hedonists, or they used their powers in the wrong. Yeah, and they ended up falling from very high places. Sometimes they were like the leaders of certain, yogic schools, and they suddenly just fell into complete disfavor because they got involved in orgies and stuff. Really? You gave it all up for an orgy? Okay. Anyway, I'm not gonna go there, but that's the danger. There are this is very real, these dangers. I once read somewhere that each chakra is guarded. There's a guardian of the threshold of each chakra. There's actually an angelic presence at each chakra. And that angel, you have to sort of have a protocol handshake with that angel before that chakra can really open safely.
That's amazing. Is there somebody written about that?
You know, I read that somewhere. It's one of those things I just picked up, and I thought that makes sense, that there's guardians. There are angelic guardians at each gate.
But it's also good to know because you have a bit of a safety, safety barrier there.
Well, I think when Steiner talked about the lesser and the greater guardians of the threshold, I think this is partly, he's moving into that realm a little bit. The angelic realm. So anyway, we could go on and on, but we probably should wrap this up at this point. It's going to be too long of a video. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alice.